All right, guys. So for this lecture, we're going to take a little bit of a look at physiology. Like I said, we're going to try to break this up into two parts. We'll talk about the main physiology first, and then we'll move on to some of the more kind of smaller portions of that. So when we look at the actual physiology of respiration, what we're really talking about is the gas exchange that takes place here. So the gas really has to cross that respiratory membrane in those alveolar sacs to make it into either the bloodstream or from the bloodstream back into the alveoli. And because of those two different processes, most of this is run by simple diffusion. There's a higher level of concentration, hopefully, in the oxygen that we breathe in, which means the oxygen should move from the alveoli into the bloodstream. And then any blood coming to the lungs should be pretty rich in carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide should be able to be offloaded into the alveoli because, again, of diffusion. Um, we do have a couple kind of protections here. So the first one is there are white blood cells known as macrophages that are available to make sure that any pathogens, either bacterial or viral, that make it into the respiratory system can be taken out there. And then there's also um, a substance that is actually produced inside of the lungs called surfactant. And what it does is it aids in that process of moving things back and forth. The surfactant is actually lipided in nature, and it's really critical to lung function in that it helps keep open those little alveolar sacs. Without that surfactant, those little alveolar sacs actually compress and will stick to each other, and then they don't inflate properly, which is actually one of the causes of a disorder that we have that we'll talk about um, a little bit later. Respiratory membrane. So you just see this. This is kind of what it looks like. So you've got blood vessels kind of packed in through here, and then the little alveolar sacs. They're only about a membrane thick, so that's why this simple diffusion takes place and is allowed to take place here. And it's pretty important for that to be able to happen. So respiratory membrane itself, again, is a thin, simple squamous epithelial layer inside of the alveolar. The pulmonary capillaries themselves are pretty well covered with that alveolar. I'll post this video again as well. It kind of shows you a little bit of the basic processes that go through there. When we talk about respiration itself, we can actually break it down into four events. All right. So the first of those four is what's referred to as pulmonary ventilation. All right. Pulmonary ventilation is simply just moving air in and out of the lungs. So the basic process of pulling air down into the lungs and then expelling that air back out, that's pulmonary ventilation. External respiration then is the exchange of gases between that air that we just pulled in and the bloodstream. Um, so again, picking up O2 and getting rid of CO2 is the basic process. But ventilation, again, just moving air. Respiration is exchange of gas. The third process here is respiratory gas transport. So this is once the bloodstream has picked up either oxygen or carbon dioxide and moving that within the bloodstream. So CO2 is actually carried on molecules that are referred to as bicarbonate ions. Um, Not really important, I think, for the assessment, but just remember the basic process here that we're talking about. This is respiratory gas transport. Oxygen, then, we already learned in the blood unit, is being carried by hemoglobin. And then it's bound in that state, and it's essentially referred to as oxyhemoglobin at that point. These are two levels that can actually be taken in lab to be able to figure out what kind of a problem a patient might be having going on. So if we see high levels of bicarbonate, we know that they have high levels of a CO2 and maybe they aren't able to exchange it as well. If we see low levels of oxyhemoglobin, then we wonder if they have enough red blood cells to be able to kind of process this. Okay. Some of it can be dissolved in the plasma itself, but again, most of it is carried by the red blood cells here. The last and final portion of that process is internal respiration. So, internal respiration, again, is gas exchange. That's the big thing here. We need to know that respiration is gas exchange, ventilation is movement of air. So, internal respiration is just the exchange of gas at the tissue level. So the offload of oxygen in from the bloodstream into the tissue, and the onload of CO2 from the tissue into the bloodstream. Okay. Um, Mechanics of breathing. So we talk a little bit about this pulmonary ventilation, so the movement of air. This is a completely mechanical process. It depends on two things, so volume changes as well as pressure changes within the thoracic cavity. So what happens here is when we change volume, it changes pressure. which will then lead to the flow of gases. So if you increase volume, you decrease pressure, so that decreased pressure allows for air to be pulled into the lungs. If you decrease volume, so compress the lungs, you're going to increase pressure and force air out of the lungs. Okay, so there's two basic phases here, inspiration and expiration. So inspiration is flow of air in, expiration is flow of air out. Um, Inspiration is pretty much all driven by muscle tissue. So it's a contraction of both the diaphragm as well as the intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm, remember, runs right along the bottom here of the thoracic cavity, separating it from the abdominal cavity. So on inspiration, the diaphragm will contract, pulling downward, essentially compressing the abdominal contents, but also at the same time increasing the volume of this space within the thoracic cavity. The internal intercostal muscles actually contract and cause a little bit of a rotation of the rib cage upwards and out, which also increases that thoracic cavity. So really it's driven off of this kind of increase in space. And what it's referred to as is intrapleural volume increases. So that if that increases, we're decreasing the pressure that's inside of the thoracic cavity, which will essentially cause air to be pulled into the trachea. This is one of the reasons why people, if they go deep sea diving, so scuba diving, they have a hard time breathing sometimes the further down they get because water pressure is forcing against the lungs. The opposite happens when people go, say, like mountain climbing. So the higher up, the pressure of air is lower than what's in the thoracic cavity. So then it becomes harder to breathe in those cases. But the big thing here is inspiration is driven by changes in that thoracic cavity. So if we decrease it, we're going to pull air in. The volume. If we increase the pressure but decrease the volume, we're going to push air out. Okay. This just shows you basic inspiration here. Again, changes in lateral dimension. So full inspiration, we can see that the ribs have kind of moved out. Again, the ribs pull upwards because of the contraction of the muscle tissue. All right. They kind of pull and rotate upwards. And if you think about that and kind of take a deep breath on your own, you're going to notice that your chest kind of expands because of that. All right. Expiration then is largely mostly a passive process. We just have to relax these muscles that we just contracted. So if we relax the diaphragm and relax those intercostal muscles, the diaphragm will pull back upwards, right, forcing the somewhat of a compressive force on the lungs. And if we relax those intercostal muscles, the rib cage kind of depresses and pushes against the lungs as well. So decreasing that volume, but increasing pressure here. All right, so you can see inspiration, then we have a completely contraction of that rib cage. It's much smaller. The ribs then rotate downwards, all right, again, forcing that pressure against, and the diaphragm is pushing upwards, okay? This just shows you a little bit of some of the anatomy here in the cat. So you can see the diaphragm is right here. We just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of that. So it sits right over the top of the liver. This is actually the heart, and you can see the left lung here, the right lung over here on this side. All right, here's your intercostal muscles. These little white lines right here are ribs, all right? And then the costals, so the external ones go essentially from the sternum to the rib, and internal go from rib to rib, all right? So you can see those there. This is just showing you some of the other ones. Deep muscles of the chest. Serratus muscles sometimes are used as part of a breathing, as well as abdominal muscles can be used in that case as well. Pressure differences in the thorax cavity here really are the big differences here. So normal pressure within the cavity space is actually negative. Okay, it's kept that way because the thoracic cavity is a closed cavity. So the difference in lung and pleural space pressure keep the lungs actually from collapsing in on themselves. If you insert something into the thoracic cavity from the outside, you will depressurize that cavity and cause the lung to collapse pretty quickly. So that's the statement here at the end here. So if the interpleural pressure and the atmospheric pressure become equal to each other, our lungs would collapse. All right. So we have to keep that negative pressure inside of the thoracic cavity to kind of keep our lungs inflated. But so that's why it's such a big issue, especially in like car accidents. If we have a fractured rib and that rib pokes into the thoracic cavity and opens up an area, we could have somebody with a compressed lung. Right, or collapsed. One of the things we really kind of stress on here specifically for physiology is the idea of Boyle's law. You guys might have seen this in physics if you had that already. It's an inverse relationship between pressure and volume. So when volume decreases, pressure increases. This equals exhalation. So think about rib cage pressing in, diaphragm pressing up. We're going to decrease that volume inside of the thoracic cavity, but also increase the pressure that's placed upon the lungs. Right. The opposite happens here with inhalation. We have an increase in volume, right? Diaphragm pushing down, opening that space of the rib cage, ribs forcing upwards and out, again, increasing volume, and it's going to decrease pressure at the same time. I'll post this. It shows kind of the basic mechanics of that here in just a second. Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead and stop there. I'll pick up with the rest of this later.